Hi, welcome to Ikate's Crossing as we continue with the Celestine prophecy, a matter of energy. We rose at dawn and drove east all morning in virtual silence. Early on, Will had mentioned that we could drive straight across the Andes into what he called the High Selva, an area consisting of forest-covered foothills and plateaus, but he had said little else. I'd asked him several questions about his background and about our destination, but he had politely put me off, indicating he wanted to concentrate on driving. Finally, I'd stopped talking altogether and focused instead on the scenery. The views from the mountain peaks were staggering. About noon, when we reached the last of the towering ridges, we stopped at an overlook to eat a lunch of sandwiches in the jeep and to gaze out at the wide, barren valley ahead. On the other side of the valley were smaller foothills, green with plant life. As we ate, Will said we could spend the night at the Vicente Lodge, an old 19th century estate which formerly belonged to the Spanish Catholic Church. Vicente was now owned by a friend of his, he explained, and was operated as a resort specializing in business and scientific conferences. With only that brief explanation, we departed and rode silently again. An hour later, we arrived at Vicente, entering the property through a large iron and stone gate, proceeding northeast up a narrow gravel drive. Once more, I asked a few probing questions concerning Vicente and why we were here, but as he had done earlier, Will brushed aside my inquiries. Only this time he suggested outright that I focus on the landscape. Immediately the beauty of Vicente touched me. We were surrounded by colourful pastures and orchards, and the grass seemed unusually green and healthy. It grew thickly even under the giant oaks that rose up about every 100 feet or so throughout the pastures. Something about these huge trees seemed incredibly attractive, but I couldn't quite grasp what. After about a mile, the road bent east and up a slight rise. At the top of the knoll was the lodge, a large Spanish-style building, constructed of hewed timbers and grade stone. The structure appeared to contain at least 50 rooms, and a large screened porch covered the entire south wall. The yard around the lodge was marked by more gigantic oaks, and contained beds of exotic plants and walkways trimmed with dazzling flowers and ferns. Groups of people talked idly on the porch and among the trees. As we got out of the vehicle, Will lingered a moment and gazed out at the view. Beyond the lodge to the east, the land sloped gradually downward, then flattened out into meadows and forests. Another range of foothills appeared bluish-purple in the distance. I think I'll go in and make sure they have room for us, Will said. Why don't you spend some time looking around? You're going to like this place. No kidding, I said. He walked away. He turned and looked at me. Be sure to check out the research gardens. I'll see you at dinner time. Will was obviously leaving me alone for some reason, but I didn't care why. I felt great, and not the least bit apprehensive. Will had already told me that because of the substantial tourist dollar Vicente brought into the country, the government had always taken a hands-off approach to the place, even though the manuscript was often discussed here. Several large trees and a winding path towards the south attracted me, so I walked that way. Once I reached the trees, I could see that the walkway proceeded through a small iron gate and down several tiers of stone steps to a meadow filled with wild flowers. In the distance was an orchard of some kind, a small creek, and more forest land. At the gate I stopped and took several deep breaths, admiring the beauty below. It's certainly lovely, isn't it? A voice from behind me asked. I turned quickly. A woman in her late 30s carrying a hiking pack stood behind me. Certainly is, I said. I've never seen anything quite like it. For a moment we looked out at the open fields and at the cascading tropical plants and the terraced beds on each side of us. Then I asked, do you happen to know where the research gardens are? Sure, she said. I'm heading that way now. I'll show you. After introducing ourselves, we walked down the steps and into a well-worn path heading south. Her name was Sarah Lorna, and she was sandy-haired and blue-eyed, and could have been described as girlish, except for her serious demeanour. We walked for several minutes in silence. Is this your first visit here? She asked. Yes, it is, I replied. I don't know much about the place. Well, I've been here on and off for almost a year now, so I can fill you in a bit. About 20 years ago, this estate became popular as a sort of international scientific hangout. Various scientific organizations had their meetings here, biologists and physicists mainly. Then a few years ago, she hesitated for an instant, then looked at me. Have you heard of the manuscript that was discovered here in Peru? Yes, I have, I said. I've heard about the first two insights. I wanted to tell her how fascinated I was with the document, but I held back, wondering whether to trust her completely. I thought maybe that was the case, she said. It looked as if you were picking up on the energy here. We were crossing a wooden bridge which traversed the creek. What energy? I asked. She stopped and leaned back into the railing of the bridge. Do you know anything about the third insight? Nothing. It describes a new understanding of the physical world. It says, we humans will learn to perceive what was formerly an invisible type of energy. The Lodge has become a gathering place for those scientists interested in studying and talking about this phenomenon. Then scientists think this energy is real? I asked. She was turning to walk across the bridge. Only a few, she said, and we take some heat for it. You're a scientist, then? I teach physics at a small college in Maine. So why are some scientists disagreeing with you? She was silent for a moment, as if in thought. You have to understand the history of science, she said, glancing at me, as if to ask whether I wanted to get deeper into the subject. I nodded for her to proceed. Think about the second insight for a moment. After the fall of the medieval worldview, we in the West suddenly became aware that we lived in a totally unknown universe. Attempting to understand the nature of this universe, we knew we had to somehow separate fact from superstition. In this regard, we scientists assumed a particular attitude known as scientific skepticism, which in effect demands solid evidence for any new assertion about how the world works before we would believe anything. We wanted evidence that could be seen and grabbed with the hands. Any idea that couldn't be proved in some physical way was systematically rejected. God knows, she continued. This attitude served us well with the more obvious phenomena in nature, with objects such as rocks and bodies and trees, objects everyone can perceive no matter how skeptical they are. We quickly went out and named every part of the physical world, attempting to discover why the universe operated as it did. We finally concluded that everything that occurs in nature does so according to some natural law, that each event has a direct physical and understandable cause. She smiled at me knowingly. You see, in many ways, scientists have not been that different from others in our time. Period. We decided, along with everyone else, to master this place in which we found ourselves. The idea was to create an understanding of the universe that made the world seem safe and manageable, and the skeptical attitude kept us focused on concrete problems that would make our existence seem more secure. We had followed the meandering path from the bridge through a small meadow and into an area more densely covered with trees. With this attitude, she went on, science systematically removed the uncertain and the esoteric from the world. We concluded, following the thinking of Isaac Newton, that the universe always operated in a predictable manner, like an enormous machine, because for a long time that's all it could be proved to be. Events which happened simultaneously to other events, yet had no causal relationship, were said to occur only by chance. Then two investigations occurred which opened our eyes again to the mystery in the universe. Much has been written over the past several decades about the revolution in physics, but the changes really stem from the major findings, those of quantum mechanics and those of Albert Einstein. The whole of Einstein's life work was to show that what we perceive as hard matter is mostly empty space with a pattern of energy running through it. This includes ourselves, and what quantum physics has shown is that when we look at these patterns of energy at smaller and smaller levels, startling results can be seen. Experiments have revealed that when you break apart small aspects of this energy, what we call elementary particles, and try to observe how they operate, the act of observation itself alters the results, as if these elementary particles were influenced by what the experimenter expects. This is true even if the particles must appear in places they couldn't possibly go given the laws of the universe as we know them. Two places at the same time, forward or backward in time, that sort of thing. She stopped to face me again. In other words, the basic stuff of the universe at its core is looking like a kind of pure energy that an intention and expectation in a way that defies our old mechanistic model of the universe, as though our expectation itself causes our energy to flow out into the world and affect other energy systems, which of course is exactly what the third insight would lead us to believe. She shook her head. Unfortunately, most scientists don't take this idea seriously. They would rather remain skeptical and wait to see if we can prove it. Hey, Sarah! Here we are. Over here, a voice called faintly from a distance. To the right, about 50 yards through the trees, we could see someone waving. Sarah looked at me. I need to go talk with these guys for a few minutes. I have a translation of the third insight with me, if you would like to pick out a spot and read some of it while I'm gone. I sure would, I said. She pulled a folder from her pack, handed it to me, and walked away. I took the folder and looked around for a place to sit down. Here the forest floor was dense with small bushes and was slightly soggy, but to the east the land rose toward and looked like another knoll. I decided to walk in that direction in search of a dry ground. At the top of the rise I was awestruck. It was another spot of incredible beauty. The gnarled oaks were spaced about 50 feet apart, and their wide limbs grew completely together at the top, creating a canopy overhead. On the forest floor grew broad-leaved tropical plants, which stood 4 or 5 feet high, and had leaves up to 10 inches in width. These plants were interspersed with large ferns, and bushes lush with white flowers. I picked out a dry place and sat down. I could smell the musty odour of the leaves and the fragrance of the blossoms. I opened the folder and turned to the beginning of the translation. A brief introduction explained that the third insight brings a transformed understanding of the physical universe. Its words clearly echoed Sarah's summary. Sometime near the end of the second millennium, it predicted humans would discover a new energy, which formed the basis of and radiated outward from all things, including ourselves. I pondered that idea for a moment, then read something that fascinated me. The manuscript said the human perception of this energy first begins with a heightened sensitivity to beauty. As I thought about this, the sound of someone walking along the path below drew my attention. I saw Sarah at the exact moment. She looked towards the knoll and spotted me. "This place is great," she said when she reached me. "Have you come to the part about the perception of beauty yet?" "Yes," I said, "but I'm not sure what that means." Further in the manuscript, she said, it goes into more detail, but I'll explain it briefly. The perception of beauty is a kind of barometer, telling each of us how close we are to actually perceiving the energy. This is clear because once you observe this energy, you realize it's on the same continuum as beauty. "You sound like you see it," I said. She looked at me without the slightest self-consciousness. "Yes, I do. But the first thing I developed was a deeper appreciation of beauty." "But how does that work? Isn't beauty relative?" She shook her head. "The things that we perceive as beautiful may be different, but the actual characteristics we ascribe to beautiful objects are similar. Think about it. When something strikes us as beautiful, it displays more presence and sharpness of shape and vividness of color, doesn't it? It stands out. It shines. It seems almost iridescent compared to the dullness of other objects less attractive." I nodded. "Look at this spot," she continued. "I know you are blown away by it, because we all are. This place leaps out at you. The colours and shapes seem magnified. Well, the very next level of perception is to see an energy field hovering about everything." I must have looked bewildered, because she laughed and said very seriously, "Perhaps we should walk out onto the gardens. They are about a half-mile further south. I think you'll find them interesting." I thanked her for taking the time to explain the manuscript to me, a total stranger, and for showing me around Vinciente. She shrugged her shoulders. "You seem like a person friendly to what we're trying to do," she said, "and we all know we're involved in public relations effort here. For this research to continue, we must get the word out in the United States and elsewhere. The local authorities don't seem to like us much." Suddenly a voice called out from behind, "Excuse me, please." We walked to see 3 men walking quickly up the path towards us. All appeared to be in their late 40s and were dressed in stylish clothes. "Would one of you tell me where the research gardens are?" the taller of the 3 asked. "Could you tell me what your business here is?" Sarah asked in return. "My colleagues and I have permission from the owner of this estate to examine the garden and to speak with someone about the so-called research being conducted here. We're from the University of Peru." "Sounds as though you're not in agreement with our findings," Sarah said, smiling, obviously trying to lighten the situation. "Absolutely not," another of the men said. "We think it's preposterous to claim that some mysterious energy can now be seen when it has never been observed before." "Have you tried to see it?" Sarah queried. The man ignored the question and asked again, "Can you direct us to the gardens?" "Of course," Sarah said. "About 100 yards ahead, you will see a path turning east. Take it, and ahead, maybe a quarter of a mile, you run into them." "Thank you," the tall man said as they hurried on their way. "You sent them in the wrong direction," I said. "Not really," she replied. "There are other gardens in that area." and the people there are more prepared to talk about these kinds of skeptics. We get people like this through here occasionally, and not just scientists, but curiosity seekers as well. People who can't begin to grasp what we are doing, which points out the problem that exists in scientific understanding. What do you mean? I asked. As I said before, the old skeptical attitude was great when exploring the more visible and obvious phenomena in the universe, such as trees or sunshine or thunderstorms. But there is another group of observable phenomena, more subtle, that you can't study. In fact, you can't even tell they're there at all, unless you suspend or bracket your skepticism and try every way possible to perceive them. Once you can, then you return to your rigorous study. Interesting, I said. Ahead the woods ended and I could see dozens of cultivated plots, each one growing a different type plant. Most seemed to be food-bearing types, everything from bananas to spinach. At the eastern border of each crop was a wide gravel path, which ran north to what appeared to be a public road. 3 metal outbuildings were spaced along the path. 4 or 5 people worked near each one. I see some friends of mine, Sarah said, and pointed towards the closest building. Let's go over there. I'd like for you to meet them. Sarah introduced me to 3 men and 1 woman, all of whom were involved in the research. The men spoke with me briefly, then excused themselves to continue their work. But the woman, a biologist named Marjorie, seemed free to talk. I caught Marjorie's eye. What exactly are you researching here? I asked. She appeared to be taken off guard, but smiled and finally answered. It's hard to know where to start, she said. Are you familiar with the manuscript? The first sections of it, I commented. I've just begun the 3rd insight. Well, that's what we're all about here. Come on, I'll show you. She motioned for me to follow her, and we walked around the metal building to a plot of beans. I noticed they appeared to be exceptionally healthy, with no noticeable insect damage or dead leaves. The plants were growing in what appeared to be a highly humus, almost fluffy soil, and each plant was carefully spaced, the stems and leaves of one growing near, but never touching those of the next. She pointed to the closest plant. We've tried to look at these plants as total energy systems and think of everything they need to flourish. Soil, nutrients, moisture, light. What we have found is that the total ecosystem around each plant is really one living system, one organism, and the health of each of the parts impacts on the health of the whole. She hesitated, then said, the basic point is that once we started thinking about the energy relationships all around the plant, then we started seeing amazing results. The plants in our studies were not particularly larger, but according to nutritional criteria, they were more potent. How was that measured? They contained more protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals. She looked at me expectantly, but that wasn't the most amazing thing. We found that the plants which had the most direct human attention were even more potent. What kind of attention? I asked. You know, she said, fiddling with the ground around them, checking them every day, that sort of thing. We set up an experiment with the control group, some getting special attention, others not, and the findings were confirmed. What's more, she continued, we expanded the concept and had a researcher not just give them attention, but to mentally ask them to grow stronger. The person would actually sit with them and focus all his attention and concern on their growth. Did they grow stronger? By significant amounts, and they also grew faster. That's incredible. Yes, it is. Her voice trailed off as she watched an older man appearing to be in his 60s walk towards us. The gentleman approaching is a micronutritionist, she said discreetly. He came down here about a year ago for the first time and immediately took a leave of absence from Washington State University. His name is Professor Haynes. He's done some great studies. As he arrived, I was introduced. He was a strongly built man with black hair, grey streaks at his temples. After some prodding from Marjorie, the professor began to summarize his research. He was most interested, he told me, in the functioning of the body's organs, as measured by highly sensitive blood tests, especially as this functioning related to the quality of food eaten. He told me what interested him most were the results of a particular study which showed that while nutritionally rich plants of the kind grown at Vincienti increased their body's efficiency dramatically, the increase was beyond what could be reasonably expected from the nutrients themselves. We understand how they work in human physiology. Something inherent in the structure of these plants create an effect not yet accounted for. I looked at Marjorie, then the focusing of attention on these plants gave them something that boosts human strength in return when they're eaten. Is the energy mentioned in the manuscript? Marjorie looked at the professor. He gave me only a half smile. I don't know yet, he said. I asked him about his future research, and he explained that he wanted to duplicate the garden at Washington State and set up some long-term studies to see if people eating these plants had more energy or were healthier over a longer period of time. As he spoke, I couldn't help glancing periodically at Marjorie. Suddenly she looked incredibly beautiful. Her body appeared long and slender, even under her baggy jeans and t-shirts. Her eyes and her ears and her hair were dark brown, and her hair fell in taper curls around her face. I felt a powerful physical attraction. The exact moment I became aware of this attraction, she turned her head, stared directly into my eyes, and backed away from me a step. I've got to meet someone, she said. Maybe I'll see you later. She told Haynes goodbye, smiled coyly at me, and walked past the metal building and down the path. After a few more minutes of discussion with the professor, I wished him well and strolled back to where Sarah was standing. She was still talking intensely with one of the other researchers, but she followed me with her eyes as I walked. As I approached, the man she was with smiled, rearranged the notes of his clipboard, and walked into the building. Find out anything? Sarah asked. Yes, I said distractedly. Sounds like these folks are interesting things. I was looking at the ground when she said, Where did Marjorie go? As I glanced up, I could see she had an amused look on her face. She said she had to meet someone. Did you turn her off? She asked, smiling now. I laughed. I guess I did. I didn't say a thing. You didn't have to, she said. Marjorie could detect a change in your field. It was pretty obvious. I could see it all the way over here. A change in my what? In the energy field around your body. Most of us have learnt to see them at least in certain light. When a person has sexual thoughts, a person's energy field sort of swirls about and actually propels out towards the person who's the object of the attraction. This struck me as totally fantastic, but before I could comment, we were distracted by several people coming out of the metal building. Time now for the energy projection, Sarah said. You'll want to see this. We followed 4 young men, apparently students, to a plot of corn. As we walked closer, I realized that the plot was made up of 2 separate subplots, each about 10 feet square. The corn on one was about 2 feet high, and the other the plants were less than 15 inches. Then 4 men walked to the plot containing the taller corn, then sat down, each on one corner of the plot facing inward. On cue, they all seemed to focus their eyes on the plants. The late afternoon sun shone from behind me, bathing the plot in soft amber light, yet the woods beyond remained dark in the distance. The plot of corn and the students were silhouetted against the almost black background. Sarah was standing beside me. This is perfect, she said. Look, can you see that? What? They're projecting their energy into the plants. I stared intently at the scene but could detect nothing. I can't see anything, I said. Squat down lower then, Sarah said, and focus on the space between the people and the plants. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of light, but I concluded it was just an after-image, my eyes playing tricks on me. I tried several more times to see something and gave up. I can't do it, I said, standing. Sarah patted me on the shoulder. Don't worry about it. The first time is the most difficult. It usually takes some experimenting with the way you focus your eyes. One of the meditators looked over at us and brought his index finger up to his lips, so we walked back along the building. Are you going to be here at Vincenti long? Sarah asked. Probably not, I said. The person I'm with is looking for the last part of the manuscript. She looked surprised. I thought all of it had been located, though I guess I wouldn't know. I've been so engrossed in the part that pertains to my work that I haven't read much of the rest. I instinctively reached for my pants pocket, suddenly uncertain where Sarah's translation was, rolled up in my back pocket. You know, Sarah said, we've found 2 periods of the day most conducive to seeing energy fields. One is sunset, the other is sunrise. If you want, I'll meet you at dawn tomorrow and we'll try again. She reached out for the folder. That way, she continued, I can make you a copy of this translation, and you can take it with you. I pondered this suggestion for a few seconds and decided it couldn't hurt. Why not? I said. I'll have to check with my friend, though, and make sure we have enough time. I smiled at her. What makes you think I can learn to see this stuff? Call it a hunch. We agreed to meet on the hill at 6 a.m., and I started the 1-mile trek to the lodge alone. The sun had completely disappeared, but its light still bathed the great clouds along the horizon in hues of orange. The air was chilly, but no wind blew at the lodge. A line was forming in front of the serving bar in the huge dining room. Feeling hungry, I walked toward the head of the line. to see what food was being served. Will and Professor Haynes were standing near the front talking casually. Well, Will said, how did the afternoon go? Great, I said. This is William Haynes, Will added. Yes, I said, we met earlier. Professor nodded. I mentioned my early morning rendezvous the next day. Will saw no problem as he wanted to find a couple of people he hadn't talked to yet and didn't anticipate leaving before 9 a.m. The line moved forward then, and people behind us invited me to join my friends. I stepped in beside the professor. So what do you make of what we're doing here? Haynes asked. I don't know, I said. I'm trying to let it soak in a little. The whole idea of energy fields is new to me. The reality of it is new to everyone, he said. But the interesting thing is that this energy is what science has always been looking for. Some common stuff underlying all matter, since Einstein, particularly physics, has sought a unified field theory. I don't know if this is it or not, but at the very least this manuscript has stimulated some interesting research. What would it take for science to accept this idea? I asked. Way to measure it, he said. The existence of this energy is not that foreign, actually. Karate masters have talked about it, an underlying chi energy responsible for the seemingly impossible stunts of breaking bricks with their hands, and of being able to sit in one place unmoved, with four men trying to push them over. And we've all seen athletes make spectacular moves, twisting, turning, hanging in the air on the ways that defy gravity. It's all the result of this hidden energy that we have access to. Of course, it won't really be accepted until more people can actually see it themselves. Have you ever observed it? I asked. I've observed something, he said. It really depends on what I've eaten. How so? Well, the people around here who readily see these energy fields eat mostly vegetables, and they usually only eat those highly potent plants that grow in themselves. He pointed ahead to the food bar. This is some of it, though. Thank goodness they serve fish and fowl for old guys like me who are addicted to meat. But if I force myself to eat differently, yes, I can see something. I asked him why he didn't change his diet for longer periods of time. I don't know, he said. Old habits die hard. The line moved forward, and I ordered only vegetables. The three of us joined a larger table of guests and talked casually for an hour. Then Will and I walked out to the jeep to remove our gear. Have you seen these energy fields? I asked. He smiled and nodded. My room is on the first floor, he said. Yours is on the third, room 306. You can pick your key up at the desk. That's it for today. Don't forget to check the links down below. Check the links on my channel. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you know when the next video will be uploaded. Take care and blessings.